want to, I asked Dr. Sandrine Matthijssen to introduce our speaker today. So thank you very much, Sandrine.
Of course.
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandrine and I teach in environmental science, if you don't know me. It's my great pleasure to have Dr. Sarah Pittiglio here because we know each other from grad school. We're grad school friends, we're in the same department. So before I tell you about her grad program, her graduate research, let me tell you a bit more about Sarah. Sarah is currently the research coordinator at the California Air Resources Board, so that she's going to tell you all about this right now, today. She's been there since 2012, and how did she get there? Well, you might think she's an atmospheric scientist, right? But guess what? She has a really diverse background. She has a bachelor in geology. So all the geologists out here, yeah, from Vassar. And then she did her master's at Berkeley in environmental science and policy and management. Environmental science, policy and management. So that's a mouthful. And then she went to UC Davis in soil science. And that's where our paths crossed. I was in hydrology, she was in soil science, we were all in the same department. And she studied the impacts of climate on nitrogen and carbon cycling in soils. And so that's how she ended up working on climate change and other air quality aspects at her current job. So she's going to tell you more about it, and yeah, we're very happy to have Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to get out of the office. And also, I'm just excited to share what we're doing at CARB. Because we're doing a lot of stuff and people probably don't know about it, and so it's nice to get that stuff from know and spread the gospel. So maybe for my talk, first I'm just going to talk about background on the research program and why we have it, and then talk about our research planning process for selecting projects that we do in-house and fund externally each year. And then I'm going to go over all the topics that we have research on. I'm going to go over a timeline that looks at the overview for each topic in the past, in the present, and the future. But then I'm also going to just focus in on one research topic or project per topic. And I tried to choose projects that had components that were done both in-house and through external contracts, just to give you an idea of what we do in-house and also just cool stuff. CARB's research program plays an important role in meeting the challenges of increasingly stringent federal air quality standards and long-term climate goals. So our program, the research program at CARB, aims to maintain a scientific foundation for the identification of new emission reduction strategies and monitor the progress of regulations that we already have in place, ensure that programs are successfully implemented in all communities. And just to be clear, CARB is huge. We have about like 2,000 people. And people are looking at how to reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of the economy. We have people working on electric vehicles, we have people working on agriculture, like every sector of the economy. But then we also have a research division, which is about 85 people, and we do in-house research projects, and we work with contractors outside of CARB to get the data that the people in the rest of the agency need to do their work and create regulations and implement those programs and make sure that they're happening. So I hope that's clear. Also, there's a lot of like programs in the state and acronyms and things that I'm really familiar with, but if I start talking about things that aren't clear to you, like feel free to ask me questions and stop me. I'm totally fine with that. The research program at CARB was established in '71, and we have both in-house research projects and external research contracts that we fund outside. And according to the Health and Safety Code, we're supposed to look for expertise within the UC and CSU system before looking for researchers outside of the system. So a lot of our projects are with UC and CSUs. And then we have multiple coordination mechanisms with other state agencies, with federal agencies, with NGOs, and like environmental justice community groups. And so if you're wondering what my job is actually like mostly going around and talking to people about what we're doing, make sure we're not duplicating research that anyone else is funding, which happens a lot. I mean, Caltrans, Energy Commission, a lot of other state agencies are trying to implement the same state programs and also have research programs. So we try to avoid duplication wherever possible, try to leverage funding to make our dollars go as far as they can. So that's my job. It's like meeting with people and talking about what they're doing and telling them what we're doing. But it's really fun and it's exciting because as you see, we're doing so much and it's all really fun stuff. And then and it's also my job to create the triennial strategic research plan every 3 years. And we just released this last one in April of 2018. And all the information I'm going to present is in there. So if you want more information about anything I talk about, you can go to our website and find it. And it's a really great document. Just check it out. And then this triennial plan will guide what research we fund every year for the next 3 years. And we get about $4 to $6 million a year to fund research. And then this is kind of boring, so I'm going to breeze over it a bit, but this is just how the process we go through every year to identify what research projects we're going to fund. And just FYI, we start off our research planning process every year with a public call for research concepts, so just 300-word descriptions of research ideas. Anyone can submit them. Your grandma can submit one to our website. And we get a lot. We get about 200 a year, and we read all of them, and then we prioritize them internally, and then from there we work with our board and stakeholders to get input on what priorities we should fund. And the RSC is our research screening committee, which is made up of technical experts outside of CARB, and they provide input on the projects we're going to fund and approve the proposals before they're fully executed. But as you can see from the figure, there's a lot of opportunities for the public to provide input along the way and keep tabs of our projects. So I'm going to use these timelines to describe our past, current, and future research initiatives. So I begin the timelines in 2000, and then I extend them to 2025 because that's the time in which any project that's initiated by our triennial research plan that we just released would be completed. And these are just high-level research initiatives, so each bar represents groups of projects, not a single project. And you'll see blue and red bars. Blue bars indicate research that has either concluded or is currently in progress and will continue to be a priority going forward. And then sometimes there are red bars, and those are just new research initiatives that we're just starting. So CARB's air quality research portfolio has been developed to provide the scientific foundation to implement our state implementation plans, which I will also refer to as SIPs. So those are the plans that California uses to implement the federal air quality standards. And so the research that we've done has been used to improve the models for ozone and PM 2.5. And then, so now we're kind of focused on long-range transport of ozone from China that's affecting our baseline concentration. Well, it's especially important as our local ozone emissions are going down, that the transport becomes more and more important. And then we're also focusing on sources of PM 2.5 in the San Joaquin Valley. That's primarily from dairies and consumer products at this point, since we've done so much to reduce PM 2.5 emissions from mobile sources. So now I'm going to go into a highlight of air quality research, and don't get too overwhelmed by all the colors, but California has a very dense network of ground monitors for different air quality measures, but not all of them are located in areas where people live, and that's why we supplement with satellite data to identify previously unrecognized hotspots and sort of fill in the gaps that the monitors don't fill in. So aerosol optical depth, or AOD, is a measure of light extinction by particles and therefore reflects particle abundance in the atmosphere column. And because this physical property, AOD, has been used as a predictor of PM 2.5, and so in-house we use statistical models to identify the relationships of the AOD to PM 2.5. And these relationships are used to estimate PM 2.5 in the areas with satellite AOD data. So through collaborations that we've done with NASA, which has gone extremely well, and with Emory University, we've acquired this 4.4 kilometer resolution AOD data, and so we're using that in-house to estimate the major components of PM 2.5, which are nitrate, sulfate, organic carbon, and elemental carbon. So as you can see in these figures, all four components generally decrease in Southern California from the period of 2000 to 2009, which is the graph on the left, through 2010 to 2015, which is indicated by the map, not the graph, on the right. So this has been really helpful because it has shown that our mitigation strategies have been effective in this region. And then for each PM 2.5 component, the extent of the changes varied in each of the grid cells. So the grid-specific progress of the PM 2.5 components can be used to assess their relative contribution to PM 2.5 in a given location. And because each PM 2.5 component is derived from a different source, so some are derived from agricultural sources, others from industrial sources, it helps us prioritize PM 2.5 components that we need to target for PM 2.5 reduction. So we're also using the satellite data to estimate exposures for health studies and for more spatially representative environmental justice analyses. So now I'm going to talk about our air quality research as it relates to mobile source emissions. So for light duty research, we've employed a variety of methods, including remote sensing and on-road portable emission monitors to support our enforcement efforts. So yes, we also have an enforcement division, which is very large, that goes around and makes sure trucks and cars are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it also helps us inform the inventory, which also helps us guide future regulation development. And then, so for light duty research, we look at, we use the monitoring data to identify high emitters and make sure the fleet is doing what it should, i.e. catching cheaters that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then we've also expanded our research to support the Advanced Clean Car program to look at how people decide what kind of car they're going to purchase, i.e. like an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion vehicle, and then also looking at fueling behavior for both electric vehicles and also like alternative fuel vehicles like hydrogen. And all of that research is going to help us inform the Advanced Clean Car program. And then for heavy duty, in the past, a lot of our research has focused on the durability of emission control technologies. Like we have these DPS diesel particulate filters and other emission control strategies. And so we've been also tracking the regulatory efforts like our truck and bus rule, and new research is going to focus on designing the best heavy-duty inspection and maintenance program that we can. And then another priority is to reduce emissions from off-road equipment and identify strategies to improve efficiencies in the freight system, because we also have a whole division looking at freight strategies that be more efficient.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With the freight, what happens if you're dealing with emitters that cross state lines?
Yeah, so that is an issue. I mean, obviously we have to think of the system holistically, because what happens outside the state affects us. But yes, that is something we struggle with. We try to look at what we can do in state by looking at like nodes in the freight system where, you know, a truck comes and then offloads it, and you know, the last mile delivery is another focus for trying to reduce emissions there. And then ports are huge sources of pollutants. So we've done a lot. There's still a lot to do to electrify equipment at the ports and try to figure out ways to reduce emissions. But yeah, most of the research is focused on what we can do in the state, because obviously that's where we have control. But yeah, we have to think about the system as a whole. So in order to address the question of how decades of evolving emission standards affect real-world emissions from light-duty vehicles, CARB initiated a project in 2013 with the University of Denver to sample passenger vehicle emissions at a West Los Angeles freeway on-ramp, where researchers had been sampling since 1999. And they found that our emission control program has reduced real-world emissions of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons, and also oxides of nitrogen, which I'll refer to as NOx. Reduced them from light-duty vehicles by 70 to 80% between 1999 and 2015, which you can see by the differences in the size of the pies. And the researchers also found an abrupt increase in the average age of vehicles from 7.4 years old in 2005 to 9.1 years old in 2015, which was reversing a prevailing trend, and that was due to the recession. The recession caused a 45% drop in new car sales from 2007 to 2009. And the downturn in the economy resulted in a large number of 10 to 20-year vehicles remaining in circulation longer, meaning that 2013 passenger cars were as much as 28% higher than they should have been without the recession, which is significant. But since 2009, light-duty sales have rebounded to pre-recession levels, but at this rate, it will still take more than 20 years to return to 2008 average vehicle age of 7.4 years. So meanwhile,
yeah. You said 20 years?
Yes.
Holy crow.
Meanwhile, the share of emissions from the dirtiest 1% of passenger cars increased between between 99 and 2015, and the highest emitters share the fleet hydrocarbon emissions, for example, grew from 17% in 99 to 46% in 2015, as you can see in the figure. So this research verifies that CARB's mobile source emission control programs are performing as expected, but also underscores the value and the need for scrappage programs to get the highest emitting vehicles off the road. So heavy-duty vehicles remain California's largest source of diesel particulate matter, which is very detrimental to health, and also our largest source of NOx. And modern exhaust treatment systems work best to reduce emissions of NOx when they're very hot, and that's defined as being greater than 250 degrees Celsius. When the exhaust is cooler, such as when you just start the car, or when it's idling or crawling through traffic, then the exhaust treatment is less effective and the vehicle is going to emit more NOx. So researchers from UC Riverside found that the exhaust of many types of large trucks and buses is below this mark of 250 degrees at least half of their working hours. So they surveyed 90 heavy-duty vehicles that represent 19 vocations, and we will use this data in-house to try and figure out where and when each type of vehicle emits the most pollution and try to target those locations and vehicles for emission controls. And you know, we do have regulations like this no idling regulation, but you know, there's also voluntary measures as well.
So how do you handle all the big data? Because I assume these are...
That's why we hired UC Riverside. But yeah, no, we have a lot of really smart people at the Air Resource Board doing a lot of really complicated research with very large data sets, and you know, and a lot of times we can leverage computers elsewhere. NASA is especially really nice about letting anyone really use their computers. So now I'm going to talk about health research. CARB's past research on the impacts of exposure to air pollution in vulnerable populations has evolved to ensure that sustainable communities develop with net health benefits. And research to identify sources of toxic gases and particles and their impacts on health in a variety of outdoor and indoor environments will continue to be a priority. It's particularly important to understand the implications of evolving vehicle and building technologies. So as buildings become more efficient, they also take in less air from outside, which can have negative health impacts. So we want to make sure that we're still creating healthy environments, even when they're climate and air quality friendly. And then exposure mitigation work is primarily focused on urban design features and technologies to remove particles that impact health. This work will continue to provide guidance to local planners and advance policies such as improved filtration requirements in buildings that will go into the state building code. So one of our biggest research highlights for health is the Children's Health Study, which was a study that went on for 10 years, and it was initiated in 1993. And it was the first major study to look at the impact of long-term air pollution exposure on the respiratory health of children. And it followed over 5,000 students in 12 Southern California communities from 4th grade through high school. And the study found that children exposed to higher levels of air pollution from traffic and other sources had reduced lung function that persisted into adulthood. They had increased asthma prevalence and symptoms and medication use, and they developed asthma more frequently, especially if they're active in sports, and they had more frequent school absences, which is obviously not ideal. So this study also helped support the development of legislation such as the Children's Environmental Health Protection Act, which required California to reassess its air quality standards to ensure the health of children. And it also spurred other research to investigate the links between air pollution and other adverse health effects among children, such as autism and birth defects. And CARB has continued research that focuses on children's health and the impacts of exposure near roadways and in school buses and the proximity to stationary sources like rail yards and ports and refineries. So I'm sure all of you know that not all communities are impacted by bad air quality and climate change equally. Some of us can't afford, air conditioning in a warming climate. Cheaper housing is usually near freeways where you're exposed to more traffic-related pollutants. So we've done research also that showed that low socioeconomic status populations have greater sensitivity to air pollution. And our research is now focusing on the health impacts of short-term exposures to toxics and also to improve our methods of communicating health impacts of real-time air quality data, because we're getting more and more of it. And then we also did in-house work on the exposure disparities in disadvantaged communities versus higher socioeconomic communities, which highlighted the need to focus on identifying the disparities in these communities to regulate them. And then research is also expanding to look at innovative methods to monitor pollution such as metals and pHs in real time, so which technology is advancing to the point where we can finally do that. So we want to make sure we implement those instruments in the most effective way possible. And then through our in-house work, we will also use the satellite data to help screen for PM2.5 in disadvantaged communities. And then CARB's in-house research with other socioeconomic experts led us to develop the environmental justice screening method, which then led to the CalEnviro screen, which maybe is a tool that you've heard of. I'm going to talk about it more later, but this line of research is expanding to focus on cumulative impacts of exposure to multiple environmental stress in multiple environmental stressors in addition to just air pollution. So this is the results of some in-house work that we did to, so we're always monitoring, in this case, diesel PM2.5 and PM2.5 and other criteria pollutants to track the effectiveness of our regulations and inform our enforcement efforts. But a recent study, we looked at monitors in communities that were identified as environmental justice communities by CalEnviro screen. That's what that tool does. And non-EJ communities. And the results indicated that pollutants with controls that impact near source concentrations, so diesel particulate matter is one of those, had the greatest decreases at monitors located in EJ census tracts, whereas regional pollutants, which PM2.5 is an example of that, are formed in the atmosphere far from their sources. Those showed similar declines at monitors located in both EJ and non-EJ communities. So the results will inform continued efforts to reduce local exposures of these regional pollutants. And obviously additional research is needed to identify the sources contributing to these remaining disparities. So now I'm going to talk about CalEnviro. And this is definitely one of the research highlights from our environmental justice research. And so we helped inform the development of CalEnviro screen with our work on EJSM. And this tool is used to guide decision making regarding the proceeds that we get from our cap and trade auctions. So CARB is also in charge of cap and trade, which I can talk about later if anyone wants to know more about that. But though there's also legislation that says that those investment projects need to be funded in disadvantaged communities or have benefits to those communities. So we use this tool to make sure that that's happening. And then also to prioritize enforcement activities and to understand how CARB's regulatory strategies have just impacted disadvantaged communities as well. So our climate research has been responsive to key legislation that has set greenhouse gas mitigation targets. And a priority going forward is to identify mitigation options in dairies, since they are a significant source of methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas.
What about F gases?
I'll talk about that later.
Okay.
I know, they're exciting. They're even more fun, yes. Our tower network, which I'll also talk about later, and our collaborations with other state agencies and researchers at LBNL and NASA will continue to help us track the progress of current programs and regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we will also continue to refine estimates of the state's emission inventory for all greenhouse gases. Okay, let's talk about gases and all the fun greenhouse gases. So, short-lived climate pollutants is also a phrase I might use, and that includes F-gases and black carbon and methane, because they're in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time than the reference greenhouse gas, which is CO2, which is in the atmosphere for 100 years. And these short-lived climate pollutants are sort of a target right now because they're in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time. So if we get them out now, we'll see the impacts sooner. So CARB continues to improve our understanding of emissions of all these pollutants through a variety of mechanisms. And it includes in-house work, and we leverage work outside with the partners that are listed here. And we're doing research on a lot of levels. Obviously, the aircraft and the satellites are something that we're leveraging, but we do get data back from those surveys. And we're also measuring at the tower network is really just a bunch of radio towers around the state that we've strapped monitoring equipment to, and working with LBNL to get that data and also to process that data. And then we have mobile monitoring platforms where we have monitoring equipment just in the back of electric vehicles, and we can drive around and we can find hotspots. The Environmental Defense Fund is also doing that. They've been very good about the outreach on the work that they're doing. We're also doing field studies, both in-house, and we've contracted that work out as well. Most of it is focused on looking at greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural soils, which is actually a huge part of the inventory. And we've also funded studies to look at different agricultural strategies to reduce emissions, and then we've also collaborated with other state agencies to develop a model that will model emissions from the soil, and I'll talk more about that later. And we also have remote sensing, and then we have the lab modeling and processing, and yeah, so in most cases we're measuring all the gases, but some efforts focus more on nitrous oxide and methane. And then the F-gas research has been really helpful. It's led to the establishment of the state's inventory. It's helped identify mitigation strategies. So programs to mitigate the F-gases include our refrigerant management program that actually is implemented in the research division. We also have the small can regulations. So there are these small cans of F-gases that you can use to replenish the refrigerant in your cars, which apparently some people do those things by themselves, not me. But anyways, when you do it, there's often F-gas left in the can, and a lot of people just release that to the atmosphere. So we have this recycling program now to get that back and capture that gas. And then we also developed a cap and trade offset protocol for the destruction of ozone depleting substances. And then we just passed a new regulation to prohibit the use of certain high global warming potential HFCs. So HFCs can have global warming potentials in the thousands. So we're trying to eliminate the highest F-gases. So we banned certain ones from stationary refrigeration equipment and from phones, which is also a source. And that was just approved by the board in March of 2018.
You said phones?
Yeah, like all that foam in my attic that's misleading. Yeah, it's full of F-gas.
So CFCs or freon are examples of F-gases, as any gas containing fluorine, right?
Yeah. So sustainable communities, if you haven't heard of that phrase, are neighborhoods that are supposed to have safe, reliable, affordable transportation choices that are equitable, and housing options that allow access to employment, education, and other services easily, and are designed to reduce the vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, in that community, because the miles that you put in your vehicle are directly related to the GHG emissions from mobile sources in that community. So our research program helps support the implementation of SB 375, which is the Sustainable Community and Climate Protection Act of 2008, which helps pave the way to us achieving our 2050 climate goal. So SB 375 encourages transportation and land use agencies to consider the greenhouse gas impacts of their planning processes and requires them to create sustainable community strategies that describe how VMT and associated greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced to meet the state's climate goals. So our sustainable community research will continue to track the progress towards meeting the goals of SB 375, and will also continue to evaluate the greenhouse gas reductions that result from declining vehicle miles traveled, as well as from more sustainable land use patterns, and from just buildings themselves. So we funded a series of white papers on VMT impacts associated with various transportation and land use strategies. So this is just a small matrix of the VMT effects of different strategies. So in the first line, you find that a 10% increase in residential density and condensed housing and street connectivity can result in a 4% reduction of vehicle miles traveled. And again, with infrastructure and services, reduce it or increase that by 10%, and you get a 60% reduction in VMT. So this helps local communities when they're developing their SCSs or sustainable community strategies figure out what the impacts of the policies that they're putting in place will have. But if you want more information on this, again, check out the Triennial Strategic Research Plan in your spare time. So cross-cutting topics are topics where historically we sort of either looked at just looking at reducing greenhouse gases or just looked at criteria of pollutant emissions, but now we're trying to focus on strategies that reduce greenhouse gases, criteria pollutants, and toxics altogether. So our past research on natural and working lands, which includes agriculture and forestry and rangelands, in the past our research has focused on mitigating GHG emissions from crops, and also looking at the potential to create renewable fuels from residues left over from forests and agriculture. But now we're sort of focusing on regional strategies to ensure the best use of biomass to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. And then for transportation research, we're trying to focus on the use of advanced technologies such as electrification, automation, and shared vehicles so that they reduce emissions. So there are a lot of fears that once you automate cars that people will just drive all the time and then VMT will skyrocket. So we want to do the research now to make sure that when people get automated cars that they're at least electric and not internal combustion. And when people are doing vehicle sharing programs, we ideally want to create policies to promote pooled vehicle sharing and not just individual vehicle sharing, because that's how you get real VMT and GHG reductions. And then our economic research aims to evaluate and minimize the economic impacts of CARB's programs and optimize the use of incentive funds. So I'm just going to go into one highlight on the cross-cutting topics. My favorite topic is emissions from soils. So agricultural soils is one of the largest sources of potent greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane in California, and contribute to roughly half of the statewide emissions just of nitrous oxide, or N2O. So California has a really diverse cropping system, and just even in a given crop, we have diverse management strategies, we have diverse climates, so it's really hard to model emissions here, as opposed to in the Midwest, where it's all mollisols and everyone's planting just 1 million acres of soybeans, and that's easy to model. Anyone can do that. But here in California, we had to adapt a lot of the process-based biogeochemical models that were already available to California-specific crops. And we collaborated with the Energy Commission and the California Department of Food and Ag, and spent around $3 million doing field research that I mentioned before to measure emissions directly from the soil to validate and calibrate this biogeochemical model so that we can estimate emissions. And that's exciting because, as you can see on the left, now we can model the emission reductions that we would get from different management strategies, like the use of nitrification inhibitors. Using subsurface drip irrigation reduces the emissions of nitrous oxide and methane because we're getting the water right to the roots, and we're not just flooding the furrows with water, which can lead to a lot of emissions because you made this anaerobic environment.
Can you talk a little bit about how the soil emits nitrous oxide?
The bugs, the microbes in the soil that are, yeah. There's carbon in soil that's exuded from roots or coming from dead plant material, and that's all processed by the microbes in the soil, and they can produce methane or nitrous oxide depending on what type of environment they're in. And when they're in a flooded environment, a lot of times they're going to produce methane and nitrous oxide. So that's a real problem with rice, right? Because they're just flooding the fields. Not to say that we shouldn't plant rice, but there are ways to do it to reduce emissions, and that's what we're now able to model. And then we've also done a lot of work to validate this in the field, and we have worked with UC Davis and other researchers to measure emissions from fields in which we've implemented these strategies. So, but again, if you want more information, check out that training research plan.
Another question?
Yeah.
What percentage of methane do the bugs produce as well? Like you said, it's like about 50% is the...
What percent of methane what?
Did bugs produce, like, from the agriculture?
Yeah, off the top of my head, the methane inventory is actually a huge portion, half of it is actually coming from manure management and enteric fermentation from mostly cows, but other livestock. And then I think agriculture, I'm not exactly sure about the current inventory, but I want to say like 20 to 30%. Yeah. Yeah. So then also on the right, now we're able to model the emissions from soil spatially, which can help us identify hotspots where we need to target mitigation efforts. And the model is currently being used by our staff in-house to develop California's nitrous oxide emission inventory for agricultural soils and a methane inventory for rice cultivation. And staff is also evaluating the use of the model to be used to assess NOx emissions from soils, which is kind of a hot topic right now. So that's pretty exciting.
It was just recently that that number became a lot larger than we thought, right? Like,
Yeah.
we didn't realize that NOxes were emitted at such high levels by ag. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's one data point.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that was also produced by a model, and all models have assumptions and use different data to validate it. So we're also trying to do that in house, and we'll see what comes of that. But yeah, every model gives an estimate.
So do farmers currently have a cap and trade program in place for what they're producing, or is that a potential?
So there are no offset protocols except for rice. Yeah, that's a good question. And there is a forestry offset protocol. So for more information, you should visit our website. But our website is kind of cool because you can click on this button that says find a project, and it will take you to the search engine, and you can put in a keyword or the name of a contractor that we work with, and it actually works really well, this search engine, which I wouldn't say of all search engines, but then you can find a website for each project we've ever funded. Which is cool because then when you go to that project webpage, you can see the overview of the project, but then there'll be a link to the PDF that contains the final report if it's already done. You can go to the link to watch the YouTube film of the webinar that we have, because we have a research seminar for the completion of every project. You should come down to Sacramento sometime and check them out. And then also any related publications in peer-reviewed journals will also be linked there, and a lot of our projects do result in peer-reviewed publications. And then, yeah, and then also I would suggest joining our listserv, because we send out announcements every time a final report gets released. We have announcements for the webinars, and then we also announce when we're accepting public concepts, research concepts that I talked about in the beginning. And if you submit one, I will be reading it. So make sure it's good. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks. Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. And if you have any questions about working in the state and the process, I'm also happy to talk about that. Yeah.
So the biggest issue with air quality in California right now, I mean, not always, is fire. So where's all the fire research?
Yeah, so that is unfortunately a really expensive research project to accurately speciate the black carbon coming off of wildfires, because it varies by temperature, and it varies by what's burning, for how long.
You did say black carbon. I didn't know black carbon was related to fire.
Yeah, so we do a lot of black carbon research and monitor through all those mechanisms I talked about, and our black carbon monitoring over the long term has shown that there has been a huge reduction, but a lot of our monitors are near roadways, so a lot of that is just a reflection of the mobile source regulations producing black carbon. But yeah, wildfire is a huge portion of the black carbon inventory. Unfortunately, it's a hard one to control, and
Is black carbon
that's the next
soot?
frontier. What?
Is black carbon soot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it could be from a fireplace or from a wildfire.
Yeah, it's any biomass burning or any hydrocarbon burning. Yeah. Yeah.
So along that line, the talk has been very focused specifically on California board and what you do in-house. But for instance, fire, there's been a big push at the federal level for increased funding into wildfire, environmental consequences, air quality. Do you, internally, do you have a group that also monitors federal funding and how to leverage dual projects? As you mentioned about partnerships with universities and the private sector.
Yeah, so we do. We talk to, we work with DOE and EPA, and it's hard because we can't ever pool money, but we can do concurrent research that's related, and we can take other people's data. So in some cases that's happened with federal agencies, but yes, we do we know what they're doing. A lot of those discussions with federal agencies is happening at a much higher level above my head, which is good because those are high level discussions. But yeah, we definitely keep track of what they're doing, and if what they're doing comes into California, we're usually always aware of it.
First of all, before people take off, make sure you know if you have a catered food in room 220 that you're all welcome to. And then also another question on that federal side of things. Your state implementation plans are to reach state standards.
Well, they're federal standards.
Okay.
So we have to reach them in California, which is really difficult for us because we have these air basins that just trap all the pollution.
So the question is, in the last 2 years, has the federal standards gone down?
And they're going down all the time.
They're going down all the time.
And it's making it harder and harder to meet them. But
Wait a minute, no, I
technology
guess I'm talking about the other way, where it becomes easier to meet them because the standards are going down. Is that the case?
No, I mean the number that of the pollutant in the air is going down, and it's harder to meet lower standards.
Okay.
It's like ozone is improving, but then we're getting ozone from China, and the standards are getting lower, so you gotta work harder to meet that lower standard, right?
Lower value.
Lower value.
I have one final question.
Yeah.
It's a lot of students in there, and we start off by saying that you have a degree in geology, and I know some of the local air board folks here came through our geology program. Can you just take a minute or two, just sort of like on your journey? I mean, did you go to Vassar thinking I want to work for Air Quality Board in California?
I had a really cool pet rock, and just went from there. No, I think when I finished undergrad, I just wanted to work in the environmental consulting field, and then I did that for a year and decided I wanted to do something other than CEQA documentation because I didn't realize that that's kind of like the only options there were at that time for entry-level positions, and so I just got really interested in nutrient cycling in soils, and and also, I mean, the thing is, the people that I work with, a lot of them also don't have backgrounds in whatever it is that they're working in now. It's just that they're, motivated people, and they did the work to learn about what it is that they're working on, and that they're passionate about it enough to just pursue it. So I think obviously it's really nice to have a foundation in the sciences. I think an environmental science degree is totally appropriate, and then from there to figure out what you want to specialize in, either in grad school or in your career.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you
Thanks for
very much.
coming.